EU leaders attending the G20 meeting in Australia used the opportunity to threaten and warn Russia of the escalating situation in eastern Ukraine. European Council President Van Rompuy led the calls by announcing a meeting between foreign ministers to discuss further steps which may involve sanctions against Russia. All the latest developments with Yusra Mehdi.
The Ukraine crisis is taking center stage today in discussions at the G20 Major Economies World Summit. And European leaders took this opportunity to raise the spectrum of further sanctions on Russia, accusing it of being involved in the escalation of events in the east of Ukraine.
Russia must stop the inflow of weapons and troops from its territory into Ukraine, and Russia must withdraw those already present in Donbass.
It was confirmed by EU's Council President Herman Van Rompuy that the possibility of further steps will be discussed and may constitute new restrictive measures against Russia.
The EU foreign ministers will on Monday assess the situation on the ground and discuss possible further steps. We need to avoid a return to a full-scale conflict. All parties should abide by the commitments they took in September Minsk agreements.
On a more positive note, British Prime Minister David Cameron and Russian President Vladimir Putin met on the sidelines of this summit today, where they both expressed their interest in rebuilding relations damaged by the Ukrainian crisis. Nevertheless, Cameron insisted that this all depends on the position of Russia towards Ukraine's issue. He said if Russia continues to destabilize Ukraine and we continue to see Russian troops and Russian tanks inside Ukraine, then there is going to have to be a different relationship between Britain and Europe on one hand and Russia on the other hand, and the potential for further sanctions. And Putin dismissed all the threats and criticism by reminding the world that sanctions are against the norms of international trade and core principles of the G20, saying that sanctions are against WTO principles and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. The United States itself created that organization at a certain point. Now it's crudely violating its principles. As Ukraine's crisis continues on the road of escalation, it seems that it will also remain a great obstacle for restoring relations between the West and Russia.
Now, to discuss this issue, we're joined over the phone by political and economic commentator Chris Bambery. Chris, thank you very much for joining us, first of all. Now, these statements at the G20 by EU officials, do you think this is exactly what's happening, or behind the scenes is there a much softer tone with Russia?
I think we're still seeing an aggressive tone with Russia, and the European Union have just implemented further sanctions on Russia. And this is amidst claims which have not been verified, the continual claims by the West, by Europe and America, that the Russians are sending military forces into the eastern Ukraine. We continually get stories that the Russians have invaded East Ukraine, and yet the stories drop. There's no evidence, there's no video. This is an area under heavy surveillance. And I may remind you that the European Union can maybe criticize Russia. But also, I would like to ask the European Union, why is it that the Dutch government has not released the videos and the report on the downing of the Malaysian airliner over eastern Ukraine? We were told that this was downed by a Russian air-to-surface missile, and yet there is now a report which is in existence. There's video of this is in existence. It has not been released. Is it because it doesn't actually match the story that was told about that at the time? So I think we should take this all with a pinch of salt. And we should also add into it that really the European governments might be one to ask that with the German economy not doing so well, Germany is very reliant on Russia. Do they want to continue going down this road of sanctions and trade wars? It looks to me like Russia is surviving the sanctions very well. Yeah. It's rebuilding its economic relationships with China and with other trading partners in the Pacific and elsewhere.
Now, specifically, Mr. Bambery, sorry, you just mentioned Germany and whether they will, go ahead with sanctions. It was announced yesterday that the Eurozone growth just about made it in the third quarter. Now, so taking this into account, do you think the EU nations, especially Germany, will be on board if imposing any more sanctions on Russia?
I think David Cameron of Britain is rather gung-ho about sanctions because, as usual, Britain is tailing behind the United States of America. I think Angela Merkel is obviously less enthusiastic about sanctions because Germany is much more tied in with Russia economically, because also it relies on Russian gas. So I think the Germans are less enthusiastic about sanctions. And I think they're also thinking that if Russia can manage with the sanctions in place without Europe, they'll become more economically intertwined with other trading partners, then maybe Germany and its accomplices in Europe are going to miss out here. So I think there's big questions here about how far Angela Merkel and Germany want to push this agenda. They don't seem to be too enthusiastic.
Now, how much of a role does the US play in these strained ties with Russia?
A big role, and the US have been much more aggressive, which is why Britain, of course, is echoing them as usual, but much more aggressive, with the Obama administration really wants to put even more sanctions in place. And we can see very frosty relationships between Vladimir Putin and President Obama. The Americans clearly want a more aggressive stance. Not a land war, I should add, they're not committing military forces, but a much more aggressive stance. And that underlies a key plank of American policy since the collapse of the former Soviet Union.
Now on the other hand,
expansion of NATO.
Yeah, on the other hand, Mr. Bambery, Putin does claim that these sanctions are illegal because they're not agreed to by the WTO. Now, how valid is this claim?
I think he has a validity. Everyone has signed up to the WTO in these pacts. Clearly, it's made this is made up as we go along. I think there's a big question about how valid a whole raft of international sanctions are. Those against Iraq prior to the 2003 invasion, those against former Serbia, the Yugoslav war, those against Iran. And I think it has to be added that the sanctions themselves are aimed at weakening the economies of these countries and have been used as very much a political weapon, as we saw with Iraq, where they were used to degrade the country prior to the ultimate invasion by the US and America. So I think Putin has a point. And I don't think you have to support Putin in any way. You can be quite suspicious of Putin, but to understand, if you're in Moscow and you're seeing NATO expanding to within a few hundred miles of your borders, despite a promise in 1990, 89, 25 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down that this would not happen. And Mikhail Gorbachev, the then Soviet leader, made the point this week that the West broke its promises over this. You have a right to be paranoid.
Okay, great. We're just going to have to leave it there. Political and economic commentator Chris Bambery, thank you very much for your time.